I'm going to start the recording now.
Okay. So welcome everyone again to VAMP, Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Richard Eldridge today. Richard Eldridge is the Charles and Harriet Cox McDowell Professor Emeritus at Swarthmore College. He also teaches at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which is not too far from here. He has held many, many visiting professor positions, including, I won't list them all, but including at the University of Sydney, at Freiburg, at Erfurt, at Stanford, at Essex. He is the author of many, many books. He's written on moral personhood, on philosophy and art, philosophy and literature, also on Wittgenstein and Cavell. But I'll just name two of his books. The most recent one published in 2019 on Werner Herzog, filmmaker and philosopher. And also, this is an older one, but it's one of my favorites, The Persistence of Romanticism, Essays in Philosophy and Literature. Today, he's going to give a talk called, so the title's changed, I can see it here, it's called Modern Being in the World, Kant's Philosophical Anthropology and Wordsworth Poetry. So please join me in welcoming Richard Eldridge.
Good, well, thank you very much, Karen. And I'm wondering, in light of the audience, is it me or is it Kant? I'm not sure. Whether it would make more sense perhaps just to talk about the paper rather than to read through it. And if any was interested, I have it fully written out so I could email it to people quite easily if they wanted to see the whole draft. Do you have thoughts about that? We might have an easier, shorter, more informal conversation if I tell you where the paper is going, as it were, and something of my motivations for it, rather than reading through the roughly 19 or 23 pages, depending on whether the Wordsworth part is in or not. What do you all think about that?
Well, it's definitely up to you. In terms of time, the only thing I would say is that whichever you decide, it's always nice to have a good amount of time for Q&A. So that would be the only consideration I would keep in mind. But it's definitely up to you. I see you also have a PowerPoint here, so I don't know if that, talking through that, if you were planning on talking through that presentation.
Maybe that will work. So let me start by saying something about the context of the paper and of my interest in presenting it here at VAMP. And then perhaps I'll try to talk through the slides quickly without reading the paper. So I retired from Swarthmore College after 38 years teaching there in May and managed successfully to move to Knoxville at the end of May. So I'm now in Knoxville, Tennessee. And my thought was, Vanderbilt is not far away from here. I actually have good friends in the law school at Vanderbilt. So coming to Vanderbilt colloquia and having dinner afterwards and things like that seemed to me a reasonable thing to have in view if we ever escape pandemic conditions. So I thought I would like to get to know people in the Vanderbilt department further. So Karen, I have met at Georgetown before in the conference Guido organized. And I know some other people in the department very vaguely. Larry May I knew many years ago, but he's now retired from Vanderbilt. And I have other connections to some other people. I'm disappointed that some of them are not here, but this is the way of the world, I guess. At any rate, that was my motivation. I had this paper on Kant lying around already written, and Nashville was relatively nearby to where I now am. This paper was written as invited for a volume called Kant and Literature. So that explains the full title, Modern Being in the World, Kant's Philosophical Anthropology and Wordsworth's Poetry. And I guess what I'm trying to do in this paper is to suggest that Kant's philosophical anthropology, his conception of human beings and their responsiveness to reasons on the one hand, and Wordsworth's poetry, especially the prelude, his great poem of self-interrogation, subtitled Growth of a Poet's Mind, that those two things both illuminate and are illuminated by each other. And the point of that is really philosophical. It's in order to try to elicit and make plausible a picture of modern human being in the world. The argument would presuppose that Kant and Wordsworth somehow count for people. That is, that making clear their views is going to be a mark in the favor of the view that I'm urging. That may not be a big stretch for this group. In the case of Kant, for Wordsworth, it might be, I'm not sure. At any rate, the paper ends up with, more or less ends up with, as it transitions from the Kant part into the Wordsworth part. The last line of the Kant exposition analysis part is this: self-knowledge, so far as it is available and matters, consists not in the deliverances of introspection, but rather in an ongoing story that provides an account of how one is developing and deploying rational powers in activity, either a happy story that makes manifest the presence of standing good reasons for one's mode of life, or a tragic story that makes manifest their absence, or more likely for most of us most of the time, a tragicomic story in which good reasons are piecemeal and intermittently manifest, but never quite comprehensive and secure. So I think that is roughly Kant's picture of human beings as beings who are responsive to reason. And the work of the Kant part of the paper is eliciting that picture of self-knowledge as responsiveness to reasons involving developing and deploying rational powers in activity. That's the main work of the paper. So I'm ferreting out some bits, oddly, of an Aristotelian language of powers and capacities in Kant, signaled, by the way, pretty clearly in his use of Kraft or faculty in German. It's in one way surprising that we find that in Kant, since he is a distinctly modern philosopher with, I take it, a modern conception of nature and resistant to the understanding or explanation of events in nature as involving things exercising powers. So I take it he accepts the post-Cartesian Galilean Newtonian picture of nature, which would ban us from using capacities or powers talk as explanatory. So it's surprising and interesting, I guess, that that talk turns out to be so prominent in Kant's accounts of what human beings are like and what they're up to. That commits me to a kind of at least anomalous monism or conceptual dualism. It must be one of the fallouts of this is the thought that understanding human beings and understanding oneself is a very different kind of activity from understanding other stuff in nature. Then the first bit of the first sentence of the transition to the Wordsworth part, again at the very end of the paper, is that Kant's description of the human being cast out from naturalness into willed exercises of rational powers that might shape courses of activity self-consciously, but with no clear recipe for doing so in view. All that is fundamental to the modern sense of self and to the literature that tracks its development, nowhere more powerfully and poignantly so than in Wordsworth. And so the last bit of the paper goes on to say something about how that is evident in Wordsworth and to speculate about the shared social conditions that motivate this line of thinking in both Kant and Wordsworth. Social conditions that I suggest are still with us and contributing to forming our contemporary sense of what it is to be a human subject in the world. So that's where the paper is going. Comments or thoughts about that, or should I just turn to the slides? What's good for you?
Yeah, feel free to turn to the slides.
Okay, let's see what we've got. I can't really tell how much. I mean, I'd planned to sort of read it through with the, oh, good. So that first slide was, again, a slide describing what the paper was going to do. I'm mostly citing famous passages and big texts, like, for example, that Kant had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Stuff we have all heard before. I'm not generating, in some sense, interpretive news by looking at minor texts, and I think my reading is not altogether striking. Still, first point A, I do stress Kant's pervasive use of the Aristotelian terminology of powers and capacities, along with his full acceptance of modern experimental physical science and its denial of powers in nature. I focus in particular on some of the etymologies of words that structure, especially the critique of pure reason. Schicksal, human reason has this peculiar fate. Stimmung, or voice, closely related to Bestimmung, or vocation. Mundig, or being mature or arriving at Mundigkeit, escape from tutelage, in the What is Enlightenment essay. Hang, inclination. Beruf, or calling. So I focus on these as crucial words that signal how it is that Kant is taking up this Aristotelian terminology. Right, then I go on to focus on the puzzle of the causality of freedom, certainly a central topic in Kant, if anything is. But I'm not trying here to explain how freedom in the world is really possible. In fact, I take it roughly, part of what it means to say freedom is a fact of reason in Kant is that it is just bound up with our responsiveness to reasons at all. This should be a familiar thought, after all, from Descartes. We are the ones who reflectively can stand back from our inclinations and desires and choose which of them to act on and appeal to reasons in making such choices. One might want some kind of paramechanics or something like that to explain how all that gets into the world, if it's all noumenal, as Kant says it is. This is the great topic, of course, of the critique of judgment, to raise the question, is it possible for freedom to take effect in the world? Would we have any kind of evidence that freedom can take effect in the world? I'm not interested so much in settling that question, as I say. Kant, after all, says in the Critique of Judgment that in the experience of beauty in nature, we get something like felt intimations or reassurances that the world is good enough to live in, but not cognitive propositional knowledge that it is good enough to live in. So I think no proof is really in view here. It's a matter of, for Kant, trust in a certain kind of experience of beauty in nature. And then I go on to consider, supposing one assumes that we are thus responsive to reason, what does the expression of responsiveness to reasons in activity in the world look like? And I focus on a number of different texts there, and some of this material is in my book, Images of History, Kant, Benjamin, Freedom and the Human Subject. It's the expression of freedom in the world, well, this will come up in the slides again quickly, I guess, is it takes place in, among other things, taking moral reasons seriously, but the categorical imperative is only an abstract principle that always requires contextual specification. That's what I mean when I say there are no recipes for rational, reasonable action. It's evident in, I argue, artistic activity as it's described in the Critique of Judgment, and in a text I spend considerable time on in my Kant Benjamin history book, in the history of the development of religious institutions, initially rooted in kind of idolatry and dogmatism toward a pure moral religion. Then the next part, wondering what in Kant's historical social world and ours makes reflection on this question, the question, what does the expression of responsiveness to reasons in action look like in the world? What makes that reflection natural and urgent? Right. I go on to develop a picture of Kantian philosophy as unceasing critique or the bootstrapping critical examination of exercises of rational powers without fixed foundation in any simply given natural order of natural or metaphysical objects. This puts me in the region of thinking about the nature of philosophy as critique of exercises of powers that I find in Wittgenstein and Cavell, among others. The concluding thought about the nature of self-knowledge I mentioned, right, that it's not introspective in any sense, but is a matter of reflecting and assessing how we're doing in our efforts in activity to respond to reasons. And I track this thought into Wordsworth. So that's sort of the full structure of the paper. Let's see what the slides say. Right, well, there's the famous line, human reason has the peculiar fate, where Schicksal carries from its root in schicken, to send, the sense of our being on a sending or mission. Go back where what do I often say in explicating the point? There's a famous line early on in the Blues Brothers where Jake and Elwood Blues show up. You know this line, yes, show up as they're trying to raise money by getting the band back together to save the orphanage. When they're asked at someone's door, are you from the police? And they say, no, ma'am, we're musicians. And then they add, we're on a mission from God. I think the idea that we're on a mission from God, in some dim sense, with a lot of qualifications, figures very deeply in Kant's account of what it is, what's involved in our having reason, our having rational capacities. That sense of mission, our taking it up, is prone to overreaching or to the enthusiastic claiming of dogmatic knowledge of ultimate realities. It's also prone to a turn to skepticism and indifferentism as well. Indifferent skepticism, the mother of chaos and night, and indifferentism, right, chaos and night, but the prelude to a coming reform and restoration of the sciences, able to rein in that overreaching while establishing the legitimate scope of reason's authority in worldly practice. That is, I think, deeply, no surprise, I think, what Kant is all about. Right, I pay some attention to what is enlightenment, where the image is we are to make a move from being domesticated animals under tutelage to daring to take a step without the walking cart, the Gängelwagen. We need to get rid of our Vormunder, our guardians, in order to do that and think for ourselves. Again, not much news here in some sense. This is a line from early on in the first critique from the B preface. He's referring here to Galileo and Torricelli and writes about them that they comprehended that reason must compel nature to answer its questions rather than letting nature guide its movements by keeping reason, as it were, in leading strings. That is, you shouldn't do that. For otherwise, accidental observations made according to no previously designed plan can never connect up into a necessary law, which is yet what reason, I can't read the rest of my slide, is and requires, I imagine. Well, the reference here, I think, to getting rid of following the leading strings of nature and to accidental observations is to the importance of using a previously designed plan, namely an artificially set up experimental situation in which one takes careful measurements. And Kant is deeply concerned with showing the credibility of experimental science. It is, after all, an interesting question. Why does something I play around with in my lab in a university building have anything in the end to do? Why are we able, by playing around with stuff there, to reveal what's going on in nature as such, which is not much like a laboratory? And I take it that much of the critique of pure reason is devoted to showing that the experimental procedures of the modern physical sciences really do work. Right, here's a famous passage from the solution to the third antinomy. Reading through that, the human being who is otherwise acquainted with the whole of nature solely through sense knows himself. Well, this paper is ultimately about self-knowledge or self-understanding in Kant. knows himself also through pure apperception, and indeed in actions and inner determinations, which cannot be accounted at all among impressions of sense. So the fundamental point is we are doing something actively, in some sense of doing and in some sense of actively, in establishing and maintaining the kind of judgmental or discursive structure that our consciousness has. And we can become, in some sense of aware, not through our senses, aware of our own activity. This line of thinking is very nicely played out in Robert Pippin's book, Hegel on Self-Consciousness, from about 4 or 5 years ago. He is obviously in one part phenomenon, but in another part, namely in regard to certain faculties, he is a merely intelligible object, because the actions of this object cannot at all be ascribed to the receptivity of sensibility. We call these faculties understanding and reason. Chiefly the latter is distinguished quite properly and preeminently from all empirically conditioned powers, since it considers its objects merely according to ideas. Well, that says it flat out, doesn't it? That we have a power, a capacity that is empirically unconditioned and considers objects according to ideas. Passage from late in the book, somewhere in the Doctrine of Method, I think. Reason does not give in to those grounds for either judgment or action which are empirically given, and it does not follow the order of things as they are presented in intuition, but with complete spontaneity makes its own order according to ideas to which it fits the empirical conditions, and according to which it even declares actions to be necessary, that is, obligatory, bindingly to be done, that have not yet occurred, perhaps will not occur, presupposing, but not independently proving, I think, however, all the while for them that reason could have causality in relation to them. So there's something different from us, about us. In reflection, responding to reasons, we're capable of envisioning life otherwise, is the deep point here. In the religion, that will mean, that is in Kant's text on the religion, and will turn out to mean capable of confronting our own finitude, egoism, and sinfulness, and developing a moral will expressed in activity in the world. So there's his account of a moral world. The idea of a moral world has objective reality, not as if it pertained to an object of an intelligible intuition. We cannot even think of such a thing, but as pertaining to the sensible world. Right, so the moral world is the sensible world somehow regarded otherwise, the sensible world regarded as capable of being transformed. Pertaining to the sensible world, although as an object of pure reason in its practical use. That is, the moral world is to be brought about by us in the sensible world through practice as a corpus mysticum of the rational beings in it. That's the thought that really captured my attention here, a corpus mysticum of the rational beings in it. It's a very Hegelian thought. We are cooperatively somehow to form a new kind of body in both individually and jointly responding to the authority of reason. It is, I think, Kant's light illusion of, or transcription of, the distinction in Augustine between the worldly church and the invisible church, where the church triumphant, the invisible church, is in fact to be achieved by us in the world. It remains an available ideal for Kant. Insofar as their freedom under moral laws has thoroughgoing systematic unity in itself, as well as with the freedom of everyone else. So another way to put what I'm doing here is to say that I am pushing the reading of Kant significantly in a Hegelian direction here. This is a famous passage from the Critique of Judgment. Again, picking up on the idea that in accordance with principles that lie higher in reason, the imagination functions as presenting nature as something that can be transformed by us into something entirely different, namely into that which steps beyond nature, beyond being mere nature. That is, it presents itself with the possibility of a moral world in sensible nature to be achieved through practice within sensible nature. Right, general precepts. So this is the part that even though there are standing principles controlling responsiveness to reason normatively or guiding it, these precepts do not tell us in any kind of determinate legislative detail what to do in life. So here are the main precepts that Kant lists: the categorical imperative, the moral law, the precepts in the critique of the power of judgment: think for yourself, think in the position of everyone else, and think in accord with yourself, be consistent. Put questions to nature by doing experiments involving measurements made under controlled conditions. See that earlier passage in the preface to the preface to the first critique. The point I'm making about this is all true, but there is a kind of now what question. We need contextual specifications of how to follow the categorical imperative and these very abstract precepts in particular situations. We remain always responsible for striking out improvisatorily while also guided by principle in undertaking to do that. And that gets me to the picture of human being in the world that I'm trying to elicit out of Kant or to sustain. I mentioned this lovely passage from The Literary Absolute by Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and Jean-Luc Nancy. They ascribe to Kant what they call a weakening of the subject. That is, what they mean here, I think, is the rejection of any kind of dualistic, substantial self, mind, or subject. The fracturing or opening of an always already given sense of who one is and what one's life is about. The sense of being a substance who can fully and legislatively somehow guide one's course of life is fractured. That's accompanied by an apparently compensatory promotion of the moral subject, by which they mean an urgent sense that we must respond to reasons, must betake ourselves to activity in a certain way, a subject that must settle for itself in context the question of who or what it is to be, a question that is not settled by the abstract precepts. As a subject, they write, the subject recovers none of its substance. I think they're alluding to the paralogisms here. Quite to the contrary, the question of its unity, what is it to be a continuing subject over time? Or as Hegel will later put it in the Phenomenology, the unity of the subject with itself must become essential to it. Or as the German actually reads there, the union of the subject of itself, werden müssen, must come about, must be brought about. We have to come to inhabit stably over time on the basis of reasons, a kind of role, or to engage in activity over time on the basis of reasons, stably. Only in that way do we become distinctively rational subjects, that is, successfully actualize our rational capacities or powers. And thus the question of its very being a subject at all is brought to a pitch of high tension as an unavoidable, never fully resolved question and problem. Right, my teacher, dissertation advisor, Ted Cohen, has in one of his books called Thinking of Others, a book largely on metaphor, has the wonderful sentence toward the end that being human requires knowing what it is to be human. This is an obviously false sentence if it's taken as a claim in biology, right? Being human, biologically speaking, requires only having 46 chromosomes, I guess, or something like that. But this is in a book on metaphor in which a signal of the present, one of the signals of the presence of a metaphor is the outrageously false. So this is outrageously false. So it's a metaphor, I take it. Being human requires knowing what it is to be human. What's the thought expressed by that metaphor? I think the thought is that much of the time, we more or less drift through life, failing to actualize rational capacities or powers, the exercise of which is both a distinctive possibility for human beings and their proper telos in some sense to achieve activity with others according to reason. A lot of the time we're failing to do that. We're instead caught up in drift or what feels like, and maybe is, a lot of imposed hoop jumping. And the thought then is, in order to know what it is to be human, you have, as Cohen goes on to say, to invest yourself in other people, in texts, in literature, have to figure out, as it were, by seeing all the interesting, weird things that other people do, what possibilities of human life might be open to us. Good, that's, I think, all going on there. And now I'm near the end. This is Henrik in a wonderful essay called The French Revolution and Classical German Philosophy, making the point, one of the great things he does in this book called Aesthetic Judgment and the Moral Idea of the World. This is the last essay in that book. One of the things that he does there that's terrific, I think, is show that the conjunction of these two ideas is not accidental. That classical German philosophy is a response to the French Revolution, and the political projects of the French Revolution are in turn ways of taking up some of the ideas and furthering some of the ideas in classical German philosophy. Both of them are roughly projects of freedom. And what Henrik is saying is the project of freedom, right, the project of life according to reason, a project of jointly autonomous free life, is still on the books for us here as an unsolved problem. Last line here, a thinking that took its departure and orientation from the freedom of a spontaneously developing reason, that's German idealism, thus converges with the problem of the organization and maintenance of political freedom within modern states and, my emphasis, modern conditions of production. So the way work is organized will have to come under reflective assessment here to form a single problem whose nature, difficulty, and weight have not become a thing of the past for us. And that's it. So I skipped you all the close reading and gave you the big quotations and the kind of bottom line here. Is it all just old news? Do you have objections? What do you have in mind here? See if I can stop screen sharing here. How do I do that? There we go.
So we can definitely open it up for questions. What we usually do is if you have a question, you can just say so in the chat, and that'll help us form a queue. And yes, sorry, please, we should please thank you, Richard, for your talk.
Oh, and I see some more people have shown up, so thank you. Maybe I should have read
the Zoom hands.
I don't know.
The Zoom clapping. So Adit, do you want to start us off? Oh, we can't hear you.
Still muted, Adit.
You don't want to hear my coughs. Okay, I have one comment, and that you may think of it also as a question, but also in one question. The comment is that it's really important to distinguish between power and faculty. In the materialist Islamic and Aristotelian tradition, the translation of dunamus is always power, kuach or koach. As Thomas objects to it for various reasons, precisely because of the materialism, and moves to faculty, which means that it is determinate already in a very particular way. That's just a comment, and that clearly influences the notions of causality, especially efficient causality. efficient and final causality. But that's the comment that I think is worthwhile.
Well, let me ask about that. So I certainly, in the paper, I spent some time explicating and defending the language of dunamis and energeia from Aristotle. So that is what I'm ascribing to Kant, more or less. But I am arguing that, and here's the question I want to ask, that we only know the nature of a dunamis through its variant actualizations, through the energeia that manifest it. I think there is no way to get understanding of a dunamis, at least of a rational dunamis. In the case of the power of a plant to grow, it may be very different. There, biochemistry is a great idea. But I don't think there's a relevantly available biochemistry of a rational dunamis. We understand what it is only by reflectively assessing exercises of that dunamis. And when we understand that, I think, we see that it is not fully determinate. This may be a point of difference from Aristotle on Kant's part. So I want to ask about that. Do you think that Kant means by Kraft that it must be something determinate? Because I'm suggesting that it's really not.
Yeah, but it's also entelecheia. I think you need entelecheia as well as energeia. But
Yeah.
But what will happen then is you'll have a problem with the notion with mechanical causality, because efficient causality in Aristotle, is not mechanical. That is why
really not. Right.
You can get from efficient causality to final causality, whereas Kant is a problem. But that's just so there'll have to be some transformation in terms of causality. My question again is, my really broader question is, how do you reconcile the third critique, especially the trust, in nature's beauty, in terms of response, and the claims in many places in Kant, nothing empirical would convince me otherwise. The empirical is vulgar.
Okay, well, in some sense,
to Kant is always, but in the world there's nothing but the vulgar. But I mean, there is certainly a tension there.
Yes, and I'm not sure I can resolve it readily. My first shot would be that the experience of beauty in nature is, how should I put this, not simply empirical. Insofar as it involves the harmonious free play of the cognitive faculties, the imagination operating freely, that is, producing an intuition, focusing attention on something, but doing so in an unconstrained, free way, that this is unlike the normal run of conceptualized sense experience. There's a considerable amount of freedom in it, in some sense. That would be the start of an answer, I think.
Yeah, but you'll need a dualist, very much a dualist conception of, for that to work in any way.
Certainly, I'm committed here, and I'm ascribing to Kant largely a kind of anomalous monism or conceptual dualism. Yes, substance dualism, no, I don't think so. But the idea human beings, insofar as they are possessors of rational powers, are responsive to reasons, have chances to, and indeed the entelecheia of, shaping their own life, means that it's important to understand them in different ways from the ways in which we understand the rest of nature. I'm a humanist. What can I say? I can't help it.
I'm a materialist. Thank you very much.
Eliza?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a really interesting paper, and I'm very obviously sympathetic to the Hegelian aspects. I like that view. Although I guess, so something I was wondering, just listening, I'm trying to understand fully the details of the view and listening to your exchange with Edith. I wanted to know how, when you lay emphasis on this idea of chances or like affordances for human beings to exercise their capacities, what becomes of Kant's story about the moral law and the idea that you can get a lot out of the capacity of reason a priori, so to speak?
Yep. It's the main topic of my first book long ago, as it happens. And I'm really recycling that and supplementing it here. So the moral law is important. Obviously, it is a command of pure practical reason, however difficult it may be to understand what that is. But my thought is, although it is binding on us, the way in which it binds on us will change as we find ourselves in different worldly situations. So one example, I owe this to a former colleague, maybe it's a law of some kind that one should be pious or express piety to God. But there turn out to be different ways in which people do that. Jews, when they go into a place of worship, put on a hat, and Christians take off a hat. It all depends. You have to know something in detail about the historical situation in which you find yourself in order to figure out what counts as expressing respect for the moral law. Okay, of course, there are some standard absolute prohibitions, right? Perfect duties. You may not lie or wantonly injure people and so forth. But the idea that there's something in context that it takes alertness, creativity, attention to figure out is especially in view, I think, when we look at the imperfect duties of self-cultivation on the one hand and benevolence on the other. Those are genuine duties, but there's latitude in their exercise. And it's particularly difficult to build a life over time, requires particular creativity, I think, to give due weight somehow to both the importance of benevolence and self-cultivation in one's life. I could, after all, cultivate my talents by doing nothing but playing the cello all day and being very unbenevolent. Or I could give all my money away to Oxfam and work as hard as I can to get as much money as I can and never play the cello whatsoever. Both of these things seem kind of unreasonable, kind of hysterical. But figuring out how to respond to both kinds of genuine demands, that's the part that I think takes creativity and attentiveness and historical understanding.
Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I really liked the talk and I learned a lot actually. But I do have one question with the setup and it sort of flows from Edith's question, but the laying out of Kant as taking this idea from Aristotle. And I think that when placed in light of the real jump between, right, the ancient conception or understanding of not only the sciences, but of the world and universe with the post-Cartesian one. So early on, if I'm not mistaken, this could be very misguided, right? But you talked about the post-Cartesian conception of nature, and despite Kant having that view in mind, still ascribes to this almost romantic view of the human, and such that understanding nature is not the same thing as understanding the human. Now, I think for Aristotle, though, and I think that part of the problem is this jump, right, from this ancient worldview to this post-Cartesian Galilean view of the sciences and what they do. But anyway, is that not too big of a jump? Because for Aristotle, at least, I guess for the way I'll put it this way, for the de anima, it's almost like the physics of the soul, in that there isn't a jump, and that understanding humans is kind of like understanding nature. Now, I could be misguided there, but I think that's a tension that I didn't necessarily see answered. And maybe you do in the larger paper.
No, I can, yeah. But. So that's all surely right. And Aristotle is a great philosopher from whom I have learned much in the philosophy of mind. But there are two problems, I think, in Aristotle, perhaps two related problems. One is the physics is no good, right? The actual theory of motion, of projectile motion in nature is no good. There is no final cause of projectile motion, right? It's all, uniform horizontal velocity and uniform downward acceleration owing to gravity. As first Galileo discovered, he got the kinematics right, the equations for that. And then Newton discovered, he got the dynamics, the force of gravity right. So the first problem in Aristotle is that the theory of what's going on in physical nature is just wrong, I think. Biology is a complicated, difficult case about which maybe Karen has a lot to say. One way to think about the difference is for Descartes and Galileo, physics is the fundamental science, while for Aristotle, it looks a lot more like biology. I think biology does not provide a good model, however, for projectile motion. The second problem that's more germane, though, I think, in Aristotle is that Aristotle, to my mind, is overly confident that the society he's living in and in which he occupies a privileged position as a educated Greek aristocrat is well ordered and in accordance with reason. Yes, there are fallings off that are possible. People can screw up the pattern, but what the pattern of practical political life on the ground is that counts as rational, that's pretty much fixed for Aristotle, and it notoriously does not include women and slaves, for example. He does not give due weight to what became evident, I think, first with the rise of Christianity. Boy, I'm having Hegelian thoughts here, and then was taken up by modern science, to the fact that we have real significant powers of changing our social and historical circumstances in the direction of political equality. I just don't see any recognition of that in Aristotle. And I do see it in Kant. It's part of the great discovery of modernity, both that it got projectile motion right and that it took up the idea initially presented in Christianity that everybody counts for something.
I do have a follow-up.
Yeah,
thank you also for the answer, but I don't mean to, well, I'll put it this way. I think that you could make even the same case for Kant, though, regarding who's included and discluded in their thought. Because for Aristotle, I mean, I'm going to take his side on this, right? You could say that there's a distinction between by nature and by convention. And that in the discussion, right, of like slavery, of man and wife, husband and wife, right, that there is this breakdown, right, where he's talking about this is by convention. It's not necessarily by nature. It's not fixed per se. And that convention can change while nature doesn't. And then you could say something like in Kant, you've got, I mean, I don't have to cite them, right, but several instances in which some people don't quite count, or some people and their ability to reason is stunted or stilted. Mm-hmm. So I think that the second, I think your first point, I have no answer to, which is that maybe the physics is no good. I think we have to ask then to what extent and how that would affect Aristotle's philosophy. But then we've got the second point of who counts and doesn't count. And I think that for Kant and Aristotle both, things can be a bit muddier, right, than just one having a better view of that than the other. So, but I do appreciate your response.
I'm not so sure I agree with that. This is
Okay.
Almost quotation, but not quite quotation. I'd have to check it to be sure. But it's in the Poetics where Aristotle says roughly, and women are inferior by nature and slaves are worthless. By nature, it's not convention for Aristotle, I think. Alas, I mean, this is one of the things Aristotle was badly wrong about. For all that he was a great philosopher. So I don't think we can let him off the hook that easily on that point. I guess that's all I want to say about that.
I indeed has a point. I have a point too.
Can we let Kant off the hook?
Oh, that's what I was going to say. That's exactly what I wanted to say. You're right. There are some nasty remarks about women and
the nation, Jews as a nation of
yes,
and liars, right?
That's exactly right.
Constitutionally, right?
Yes. No, and
I
so
mean, the man whose physician is Jewish and who corresponds with Mendelssohn, okay, but the nation of cheaters and liars, not to mention what he has to say about non-whites.
Yes, no, that's all correct. And that was the second part I was going to say, is that there are some quite nasty remarks in Kant along similar lines. I think, however, there are two, and I don't want to deny their importance or that they somehow shaped his thought in pernicious ways. However, I do think that the idea that we are all politically equal in possessing practical reason is at the core of his thought, and that he becomes more explicit about this as he goes on in his career. So he endorsed, for example, I think to his own surprise, the revolution in Haiti, right, led by Toussaint Louverture, showing that Blacks have a kind of genuine capacity for self-governance. He was slow to come around to this, certainly slow with respect to Jews and women as well. There are real problems here. But there, I think, the hard distinction to make, and why I will ready to make it in Kant's case but not in Aristotle's, is an interesting question. I feel more comfortable distinguishing between the core of what is Kant is committed to and these nasty penumbra than I do in the case of Aristotle.
Well, we certainly do not agree there, because Hegel at the end, I mean, says, okay, let the Jews become citizens.
Mm-hmm.
They should have been overcome. Somehow they're a historical anomaly, but they contribute to society.
Yep.
Let them. Kant never does.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Never. I mean, and this is a man, and what he has to say, on the one hand, he praises Maimon.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, in the correspondence, he says, Maimon, who prefers making, like called Jews, making his reputation on the back of somebody else.
Yeah, no, that's of course.
And Judaism is absolutely dripping.
Yes, no, that's of course exactly right. And I do not wish to defend him on that. The only thing I have to counter to it that I think accounts for my preference for my judgment in favor of Kant over Aristotle on this point is the idea asserted strongly in many places that human beings have the possibility of and responsibility for shaping their own life autonomously, all of them. I mean, he's committed to that as a generalization about human beings. How he can then say these other nasty, awful things is an important problem.
Robert.
Thank you so much for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed it in the Q&A.
Oh, let me add, I didn't see how many people were here. I didn't really give the talk. If people want to see the full written version, I would be happy to send it to you. Just send me an email and I can do that.
Well, I would be interested in a way, I think this question sort of comes out of, well, it connects to what Edith and Andrew were raising, and it might be a product of my not having read the paper. So it seems like most of the self-knowledge that you talk about in the case of human beings, it seems that this would extend to what Kant recognizes as just rational beings in general, being responsive to reason, being self-determining, autonomous. This all seems to, well, it might apply to human beings for Kant. It also seems to extend beyond the human to, the rational alien or whoever. So I'm wondering if there's something peculiar that you're trying to get at here that is unique to human beings as opposed to all rational beings. And yeah, I mean, maybe I've missed something in that respect. So
I think I have no views about that. So Kant does sometimes talk, you're quite right, about all rational beings, as though that were a class potentially, maybe actually wider than human beings. My own view about that is we just don't know anything about that. So it is compared to other animals. Now, I want to be kind to animals too. Other animals have sensory consciousness and awareness. They clearly respond to their environments differentially. They have what some philosophers call proto-intentionality or rectic desiring attitudes, and even a kind of personality. Animals are very interesting in this way, but they do not, the higher mammals, my dog is interesting in this way, but they do not have the same degree of capacity to step back reflectively from their commitments, assess them and revise them radically. My dog, for all that she is sweet, does not have an option not to lead the life of a dog. We have a lot more options than that, and that's the contrast I'm interested in drawing, that we are makers of our cultural lives in ways that other animals are not.
can I have a quick follow-up to that? Maybe this is another way of, I mean, it's a kind of related question. because, you know, I buy all of this, that something about self-knowledge of human beings would consist in knowing a sense of what our possibilities are and how we can, you know, make.
And among those possibilities, which of them are such that there are good reasons for them? Which of them are responsive to the way things are? Yeah.
Right, which is in part a very definite, the very determination that these are instances of progress. But I mean, does Kant have anything to say, or maybe do you have anything to say that's related to Kant on this, about how self-knowledge might also consist in determining how we're also the kinds of beings who can subject ourselves to self-incurred tutelage, how we can, you know, dehumanize one another, things of this nature that aren't exactly progressive and good, but maybe the bad parts of our nature.
I think Kant actually has an eloquent account of that, and it is our, as he puts it in the history of essay, our inherent propensity to want things to go our own way, according to our immediate instrumental conception of our interest. A line he develops at great length in both the Metaphysics of Morals and then in the Religion, where he defends a version of roughly the doctrine of original sin, an inherent tendency to go for what one wants in a way that's contrary to reason, ultimately to moral reason. And yes, one of the bottom lines of my view is I'm actually prepared to defend Kant's conception of original sin. I mean, no blood stain coming from Eve or all that, but an inherent tendency in the human character as it develops toward egoism and self-seeking, with which we must struggle in the depths of our heart. And it's not fun, right? Yeah, I'm committed to all that. That's what makes us perverse in many ways. It's the flip side of our being interestingly able to make new forms of life.
Thank you.
What's the line in the history essay? We must mix with our fellows, unsociable sociability. We must mix with our fellows whom we nonetheless cannot abide. A kind of perfect description of a university philosophy department, it seems to me. Life is like that.
Thank you.
Emma.
Wow, it's pretty hard to follow that. So first of all, if Richard will permit, I wanted to signal to Robert, there is a beautiful collection that's just come out, edited by Lucy Allais and John Callanan on Kant and Animals, which is entirely dedicated to this. So advertisement finished. So my question might be too big or might be very quick. I've noticed that at the very beginning, you defined Kant as modern insofar as he should be resistant of the idea of capabilities, having explanatory.
With respect to nature, yes, yes.
And I'm certainly sympathetic to that, but if I agree with you that that's an interesting definition of modernity, I think modernity ended with Leibniz, especially, not entirely, so this is too strong, but certainly I see that the notion of explanatory capabilities seems to loom in every time a philosopher admits of teleology.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is, do you see this as well? Do you see this interconnection between a so-called internalized teleology in the notion of capability and of, of capacity, Aristotelian capacity, and so on and so forth?
I wish I could argue for my view here better than I'm able to. Have a kind of story I won't even try to tell that kind of arises out of Wittgenstein and Davidson on this, is where it comes from. But I am defending something like a teleology of reason, or an eros of reason, a directedness of reason to the inauguration and monitoring and maintenance of free and meaningful life according to reason. But, and here's the part that's puzzling, and I think Kant is committed to this too, so it's puzzling in Kant. I want to restrict that language of teleology as fully explanatory only to rational capacities, not to other kinds of capacities or powers. Here I am with with Moliere's joke, right? That we should not explain the power of opium to put us to sleep by saying it has the dormitive virtue, that powers explanations in the physical sciences are typically simply question-begging circular. I think, we're committed to decompositional analysis and loss assumption in modern science. It's been spectacularly successful, and talk of powers and final causes simply drops out there. Quine, I think, got all that right. The problem with Quine is his view that human beings are no different from the rest of nature. So he sees human beings as to be understood only in ultimately physiological terms, thereby dropping out the whole idea of responsiveness to reasons. So that's my view on this issue. I'm well aware that Leibniz thought he could have it both ways, for example. But I confess I just don't understand Leibniz on that point. If other people can show how we can combine, in some sense, the languages of teleology with the language of law subsumptive causality in understanding nature, how we need both languages, that would be something. I guess maybe Karen's interested in this, or various people who are taking up Schelling in one way or another are interested in this. I nonetheless, somehow, I'm not convinced yet. I just can't see on those points that Schelling or Leibniz was right and Quine was wrong.
Well, I think Kant was interested in this too. I put myself in the queue after Emma. Maybe a comment, and then I'll ask my question. My question has gotten more muddled because as I'm listening to all these other questions, they kept changing or folding into my question. But the comment was just more on this language of powers, capacities, and the language of the ambiguity in thinking about the language of Croft, especially in trying to connect it, sort of trying to draw this line from an Aristotelian understanding of powers and capacities to the way that Kant does. Because so when he's talking about Ortels Croft as the power of judgment, that might be closer to thinking about powers and capacities, but of course Croft is also force. And so in that context in that more modern context, I know we're now using the term modern in many different ways, but in the non-Aristotelian context that Kant and a lot of his contemporaries are using that term, it's not clear that how neatly you could sort of just draw that line from Aristotle. But I'm just sort of adding to the conversation that's been going on about the difficulty of tracking that language. So my question so I was very sympathetic to what I saw to be the overarching aim of your paper, which was in a way to present, if I can put it this way, a nicer Kant, a softer Kant, where, against the sort of rigorist or rigorism that, Kant is sometimes accused of. And so I'm very sympathetic with that it's, the sort of rigorism that he's sometimes accused of is unfair. And so in talking about Kant's anthropology or talking about the human being, although in Robert's question, there was some question about whether or not we are talking specifically about the human being. But since in the title of your paper, it says you're interested in Kant's anthropology, you wanted to just open it up so that we're not only thinking about the human being in exclusively rationalist terms, even though you want to hang on to this idea of responsiveness to reasons. So the question is, I wonder if you also said in the paper that our self-knowledge is different from the knowledge of nature. And I actually want to maybe challenge that a little bit on certain Kantian grounds, especially if you sort of think about the Kant of the Third Critique, where it seems that where knowledge of knowledge of self and knowledge of nature become connected in a different kind of way, precisely because our understanding of nature is being expanded beyond the purely mechanistic version of nature that we sort of assume in the first critique. And in the third critique, of course, that experience of nature includes experiencing nature as beautiful, but of course, even though I hear that you're reticent about this, experiencing nature as living. But it seems to me that once we expand that notion of what it is to have knowledge of nature, then it might not be that our self-knowledge is somehow categorically distinct from what's going on when we're trying to have knowledge of nature.
It's a lot there. And in one way, that's right. At least I am committed to thinking of human beings as natural beings. So if we achieve self-knowledge or understand ourselves, we're understanding something about natural beings, including facts about ourselves, such as we have certain drives, for example. So I'm okay with all that. But I'm also arguing that we are exceptional natural beings in being reason-responsive natural beings. So the first thought you started with, that I'm sort of driving towards a non-rigorist view and to a kind of responsiveness to reasons without rationalism, that's exactly right. I want the picture of us as responsive to reasons without a lot of stuff about how to be responsive to reasons settled by a priori argument. This goes back to Eliza's question about how much I'm leaving open to contextual determination. So there is some sense, I think human beings are biologically evolved natural beings who, for some reasons, we do not know how or when, increased memory capacity and processing speed of our brains somehow in interaction with each other became norm mongers, concept appliers, and reason responders. And from that point, however it happened, what we began to do was form culture and lead lives within culture. And I'm interested in how all that happens. About the third critique, I guess I don't have much to say other than that I think I read Kant as committed to teleology as only a heuristic in the third critique. And I kind of share that instinct without, again, I don't work on philosophy of biology. I know there are hard cases here maybe in what biological understanding might be that could distinguish it from physical understanding or even biochemical understanding. When I talk to my biologist friends about the function of things, like the function of the heart is to pump blood, or the function of the turtle shell is to protect the turtle from predators, I ask them what they think about that language and whether they regard it as explanatory. And what they all say is, well, yes, we talk that way, but really at bottom, it's all just mutations and biochemistry. The heart pumps blood. I guess that's what it does. I guess that's its function. But the way it got that way and why it does that job, there's some big story about mutations and chemicals in the background there. So I guess I don't know any more than that to say about what's going on in biology these days. Maybe I can say something useful by giving an example of self-understanding, by appealing to, in my view, one of the greatest writers on self-understanding who has ever lived, who tracks the overcoming of self-misunderstanding pervasively, namely Jane Austen. And I'm thinking, among other things, of the scene in Pride and Prejudice where Elizabeth gets the letter from Darcy that gives her the backstory of his childhood and dealings with Wickham. That explains what's really been going on with Wickham. And the line occurs when she reads that letter. This I can quote, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." What's happened? She hasn't introspected anything. She's gotten a new, broader understanding of the context that's forced her to reassess both her own motives and her own judgments about what's been going on, to reassess her own story about what she had been doing in that social world. The same thing happens maybe in an even more dramatic way in Emma. That's what I'm interested in, that human beings are capable of that kind of surprises and reversals in self-understanding, often involving in both those cases a kind of overcoming of egoism as it happens on the parts of both Elizabeth and Emma. That's the teleology of reason I'm interested in, the nurturing and expression of our capacity to do that.
I like both of those examples a lot. Guido.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much for the talk. I also appreciate a lot the discussion. I have a question about self-knowledge, and you are perfectly right that Kant unveils the fact that self-knowledge is a power, and the self-knowledge for Kant is very different than the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, which is a tautological form of knowledge. So self-knowledge by Kant, like also by Hegel, is the capacity to relate everything to an order of concepts autonomously elaborated. But so I think that this power in Kant is still weak in comparison to Hegel. Let's define what does it mean having self-knowledge. So you also mentioned that human beings don't just live their lives, they define their own life. So we define, we describe, and we determine our life just by...
Some of us are too craven and cowardly to do that, but yes, we can.
Yeah, we should. Right. Yeah, we are supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. So we are supposed to discuss about ourselves, discuss about what is good for us, what is bad for us, and by making this, we define and we determine our life form. Other species don't do that. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think so. In Kant, this power is described still in a very weak way, because knowledge for Kant is just a finite. In fact, for Kant, we can just know finite objects. So the object of our experience. Okay, for the moral judgment and for aesthetical judgment, in which Kant says that we have a kind of infinite power, infinite knowledge. By imagination, for example, we can extend a lot the capacity to the aesthetical experience, and also by the moral judgment. But in the very cognitive and theoretical dimension of the pure reason, we are limited to the finite judgment about the empirical object. So, and I think that the enhancement that we have with Hegel is really this, that we can have a form of self-knowledge much wider, by which we can theoretically develop a very strong philosophical system, and by which we can think about ourselves as beings that can have a representation about everything practically. And so the science of logic for me is the accomplishment of the critique of pure reason. And it is also that the text, the Hegelian text, in which Hegel directly faces the problems of the critique of pure power, of the pure reason. So do you also think that this power, the power provided by self-knowledge in Kant, is explained in a very weak way in comparison to Hegel. Do you think that we need the enhancement provided by Hegel in order to complete a theory about self-knowledge?
The answer is yes and no. I agree, I think, with almost all of that, in fact. So I'm one of the people who tends to minimize the differences between Kant and Hegel. I certainly see Hegel as taking up the Kantian project of characterizing self-knowledge in the form of responsiveness to reasons as expressed in worldly activity. So in that sense, there's a great continuity between Kant and Hegel. I think I further agree that on the whole, Hegel's account of what responsiveness to reasons looks like on the ground, stressing the point that the reasons must be such that they can count for everyone, they must be shared reasons in some sense, is richer and more interesting on the whole than Kant's account. So we get nothing like Hegel's rich account of family life or practices of worship or of modern, well, of a modern economy or of the importance of art in life. We don't really get the details of those things in Kant that we get in Hegel on the whole. Well, there's a lot in the metaphysics of morals, by the way. Still, on the whole, Hegel has a richer account of each of these things than Kant does. What I resist in Hegel are and I think this is unavoidable, I think Terry Pinkard gets this wrong, are the closure claims, that the idea that the process of arriving at collective self-understanding can be fully, satisfactorily, happily completed. I resist the thought that philosophy can get fully clear about this without metaphor and imagery that characterize religious thinking, for example, and in a way that characterize artistic thinking. So here I think Hegel was right to see art, religion, and philosophy as deeply related to one another, but wrong to see philosophy as a higher form of absolute spirit. And I think the importance of continually struggling with one's own sinfulness in situations with others, I think Kant has a sharper sense of that than Hegel does, for all Hegel's richness on other topics. So how far apart are we on this issue?
Yeah, I think a bit, yes, a bit far apart. So for sure, particularly in the moral judgment, Kant explains this infinite effort of the human being to be free and to determine himself or herself. But from a very theoretical and cognitive perspective, Hegel, I think, is more complete because for him, we can have a representation of everything. So we can really have an infinite knowledge by self-knowledge.
What I'm resisting, that's right.
So, and for example, I think about the teleological judgment. So the teleological judgment in Kant is just in the third critique, so in the critique of judgment. Whereas in Hegel, teleology, like life, are two categories, two very important categories, necessary for defining self-consciousness and also for defining self-knowledge, and they are treated as cognitive categories, so as categories by which we can have a truly representation of reality. So if you are a systematic thinker, you would probably more appreciate Hegel than Kant, because you would probably more appreciate the effort to have a complete and exhaustive vision and comprehension of what self-knowledge is. In the critique of pure reason, self-knowledge is just useful for having empirical knowledge, for having a kind of finite knowledge. And Kant refuses the possibility of speculative knowledge. The speculative judgment is very bad. It's a very bad philosophical thing for Kant. Whereas in Hegel, there is this challenge, we can say, so this effort to improve our philosophical grammar, and in order also to enforce our capacity of having philosophical imagination and philosophical comprehension of reality and of ourselves. And
well, let me comment on that. Maybe we can see where we come out. So again, I accept the richness of Hegel's thought about these things, his willingness to track the life of reason into many domains, though I'm suspicious of the philosophy of nature. I do think he has an interesting, let's call it emergentist developmental psychology, for example, in the first part of the third volume of the encyclopedia. There's nothing like that in Kant. He has a developmental theory of mind in both individual terms there and overall of responsiveness to reason in historical cultural terms. That's much richer than anything in Kant, though there's more in Kant than many people would think. So there's a lot to be learned from Hegel. But yes, I am, in Hegelian terms, I guess I'm a thinker of bad infinity. The process never gets completed. We are stuck in eternal striving. But that's because it seems to me that life is like that. As Stanley Cavell once said, in philosophy, there are certain arguments that must not be won, right? And what he meant by that is we're always somehow talking out, confronting our positions with each other, where we are in some sense deeply different from each other, even though we're all reason responsive. And all that never gets fully worked out, I think. It's an ongoing process. That's the part I'm taking from Kant against Hegel. So yes, there's a great deal to be learned from Hegel, but I think the closure claims, as I put it, are too strong in Hegel.
Too strong.
Too strong, yep. The idea that we can arrive at full satisfaction is too strong. In the philosophy of right, you will recall, he says that basically everyone can find his knowledge and volition satisfied in the modern state. That is, they can find something worth choosing and know that there are good reasons for it. That would be great. And the details about how that's possible are incredibly interesting, but it just isn't true, is it?
Yes, so you think that this rational power of self-knowledge should be weakened? So we need to weaken it.
We need to regard it as an open, the pursuit of self-knowledge as an ongoing dynamic process subject to contestation, despite there being also some standing constraints. Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, that's where I am.
So I think we have time for one more question, Eliza.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. This is a follow-up to a couple of questions, I think, to Karen's and to Guido's, and more just tracking something I've noticed throughout the talk, and something that as a crazy Hegelian, I would like to reject, which is the authority of science as a form of explanation. Like, I think science is great. I think it's a great human practice. I think it's pragmatically helpful. But I guess I'm curious what role you've referred to, like quite a few times, to sort of the authoritative explanatory paradigm of physics or biology over philosophy. And I want to know what role that plays for you in this account. I don't know.
Oh, no, quite the contrary. So hooray for science, but not for scientism. Here I am a responsiveness to reason's non-naturalist theorist, right? And no, I absolutely think there are important forms of human self-understanding or philosophy that are not experimental scientific and are just it playing a different game is the point, right? And the thought that natural science will help us to get a grip on which of our commitments are reasonable commitments, that's a hopeless thought, it seems to me. No, so hooray for science, but not for scientism, not for the extension of science beyond its proper sphere of competence.
I guess it seems to me the picture in the first place, like it begs the question in a way, because you assume that science has authority over the objective domain in the first instance in
Yeah,
order.
that's true. I do.
Yeah.
Over, is it the objective, the domain, the right way to characterize it? Over the physical in some sense. And yeah, interestingly, I don't have an argument for that. Here I'm a good Quinian. The argument for it is the bridges don't fall down when the physicists build them.
Yeah.
That's the argument. It doesn't need any better argument than that. The antibiotics work better and so on when we do all that lab stuff. And it's hard, right? Yeah, that's the only argument I've got.
That's why you're a Kantian, not a Hegelian.
I was just going to say that.
Maybe. I do not make much sense, I confess, of Hegel's general philosophy of nature. That's true.
Thanks.
Yep.
We're out of time, but quickly to what you just said. Of course, I don't want to deny that the antibiotics work and the vaccines work and all and that we go to the moon. But your paper is about self-knowledge, right? And specifically the self-knowledge of human beings. So it seems, and I'm just maybe asking Eliza's question again, it seems that if that's what we're interested in, then it's not clear that we need to cede quite as much as you seem to be ceding to the natural sciences, especially, for example, with respect to a concept like teleology. And I would actually say, I don't know that even Kant cedes quite as much. Especially when we're talking about the Kant of the third critique.
Yeah, I don't have a settled view. Maybe we could, I need to think about this a bit. I'm not really a philosopher of nature or science at all. But in certain moods, I would be happy with a pluralism of sciences that's a lot looser, with physics having a less central place. So biology and chemistry and physics might have different explanatory schemes. People like John Dupre and Nancy Cartwright have argued this kind of view at length, and I have some sympathy with that. I'm also struck by how much the physics really matters to the chemists and the biologists, right? So I guess I'm in tension here. I have both thoughts, and I don't really have an argument either way. If our picture of nature has to be more complicated than the straightforward physicalist picture with physics as having full explanatory priority, maybe I can live with that. I still wonder about the teleology part, right? And I need an argument there. And this is what I asked you about with your book, right? I certainly accept that Hegel adopted the conception of teleology from the Critique of Judgment and made it objective. That seems to me exactly correct as an account of what Hegel is doing in getting his thought about nature started. What I'm not yet convinced of is that there are good reasons for that on Hegel's part, right? Or what those good reasons are. Well, we can talk about that more. Here we need to do, I guess, real serious philosophy of science that I haven't done. Yep.
Well, so please join me in thanking you, Richard, for a really wonderful talk and a great discussion. Thanks to everyone for their questions.
Great to get a chance to present this to you and hear your reactions. So thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.